Hey Canonites, welcome back. It's been a long road. Too long, I think you'll agree, but we're finally here at the end. Today concludes the bulk of the Halo Wars 2 breakdown series as we dive into the second and largest of Halo Wars 2's DLC, Awakening the Nightmare. Announced during E3 2017, this DLC was incredibly anticipated by fans of Halo Wars, and even Halo fans in general to a degree, as not only would we be playing as the Banished, but we'd finally see the return of the Flood, albeit briefly. So without further ado, let's dive into the story of Awakening the Nightmare. Set 2 months after Halo Wars 2's main campaign, we open as Atriox finishes a briefing with the two main characters of this DLC, Jiralhanae brothers Voridus and Pavium. Immediately, we can see that kinship as Pavium warns Voridus to adhere to Atriox's instructions, a warning Voridus basically laughs off. Though this scene is short, it establishes these characters of Voridus and Pavium quickly and efficiently. Pavium is the older brother and stereotypically the responsible one, and like an older brother, he is concerned for his foolhardy and glory-seeking brother. And through their dialogue, we learn that Voridus is exactly what you'd expect from a younger brother, brash, foolhardy, and the spirit of the Jiralhanae, glory-seeking. The cutscene ends with Voridus leaving for the High Charity crash site, Pavium worried about his brother. The game itself opens with a mission to High Charity led by Voridus. Pavium meanwhile works on power extraction and ship salvage in another location. The area around High Charity, as one might expect, is heavily guarded by Sentinels. To deal with these, Pavium lays down a number of disruption emitters at Sentinel launch sites. Interestingly, when Voridus first approaches the Holy City's crash site, Pavium notes that the Sentinels might be guarding rather than protecting the site. Voridus immediately says,
"The old stories of the parasite. Nothing but Covenant propaganda, old friend."
Now I can't help but find that interesting. While we might know the Flood to be a real threat, as did many within the Covenant, it seems that to others the Flood was little more than a rumor, a boogeyman. Given that there were cults within the Covenant that saw the Flood as something to be worshipped, it's not unsurprising to see the opposite extreme. And if Pavium and Voridus joined Atriox before the fall of the Covenant, it would make sense that Voridus and others might think the Flood to be, as he says, propaganda. Moving forward, Voridus continues to fight off the Sentinels, even coming across human forces at one point, marking the first time that we have fought against human enemies in a Halo game. Unless you count multiplayer. Eventually, Voridus reaches High Charity, only to be attacked by Retriever Sentinels. Voridus thankfully manages to utilize a Forerunner interface to deactivate Sentinel defenses in the area, causing the Retrievers to retreat. Finally, Voridus' Scarab makes its final approach, using its excavation beam to cut a hole into the hard light surrounding High Charity. Now before we get into one of the coolest Halo cutscenes in the history of the franchise, we need to talk a bit about High Charity. As you should all know, during Halo 3, High Charity made its way to the Ark, crashing upon arrival. After John 117 infiltrated the site to retrieve Cortana and the activation index she carried, the pair destroyed a series of power nodes to destroy High Charity. And here is where we start running into problems. Halo 3 does imply, at least on the surface, that we did destroy High Charity, and when Awakening the Nightmare revealed High Charity's involvement in the plot, people were understandably confused and even upset. However, the idea that we destroyed High Charity never really sat well with me, as we're talking about a space station almost the size of Ceres, a dwarf planet. High Charity was primarily powered by the Forerunner Dreadnought too, so whatever power cores we destroyed are secondary or backup systems of some kind. Given this, I could never really accept that the damage we did was all that serious, and while yes, we do see the surface of High Charity burning and exploding, it's a very small part of the surface. Again, High Charity is huge. That addressed, we move on to the Phoenix logs that are relevant to this part of the story, which features 000 Tragic Solitude, the former monitor of the Ark. There are 4 in total dedicated to Solitude, all set just after the end of Halo 3, but the gist of their content is him having Sentinels raise the Hard Light Dome over High Charity and raising the environment around the former Holy City. He also modifies the Refuga so that no sentient life or Flood food could survive, and places several Sentinel defenses around the area. Given outbreak protocols seen on Delta Halo, I'm actually somewhat surprised that a Sentinel wall wasn't put in place, at least none that we see in the game. There are also bits that kind of hint at the actions that Solitude would ultimately take in Halo Hunters in the Dark, but those aren't relevant to this analysis. They are a worthwhile read though if you really want to get the full Halo experience. Other logs dive into the UNSC exploring the area around High Charity in the days before Awakening the Nightmare, and a couple more logs from the Banished are set the day of the DLC June 4th. There's little else to dive into story-wise at this point, however. But now, we finally come to what may be the coolest cutscene in the history of the franchise. Vortis has reached the shell of High Charity, breached the hard light barrier surrounding it, somehow melting it, and sends a few of his men to scout inside. Initially, they find little of interest, but something lurks in the shadows, an infection form. It attacks, but the brutes are too quick. Thinking themselves safe, their triumph is quickly turned to terror as a greater threat surrounds them. Outside, horrified sounds can be heard until a flood-infected brute emerges, its body horribly misshapen and grotesque. As Vortis tells his forces to prepare themselves, the infected brute shrieks and hundreds of infection forms flow from High Charity, and from there the brutes are engaged. The terror of the Flood is made complete when a new form emerges, turning the tide in the Flood's favor as more of the parasite begins to spread across the Ark's surface. This cutscene is just perfect. It encapsulates the terror of the Flood and shows us more than any other game just what they're capable of. It's a glorious moment to behold for any fan of the Flood. One thing I do want to discuss is the glowing abomination-like form we see in this cutscene though. Now, I've said a few times during this series that nothing is ever properly to scale in an RTS during gameplay. Though we see abominations towering over the Flood during gameplay, that doesn't necessarily represent their actual size. So, like others I'm sure, I was wondering if the size in this cutscene was the true scale of abominations, or if the forms come in differing sizes. Luckily, it would seem that the Phoenix logs provide the answer. In the entry for the abominations, it does mention that these forms are as massive as the gameplay implies, but it also notes that these war forms are an evolved form of the Juggernaut combat form. The Flood Juggernaut, if you don't recall or don't know, was a pure form meant to appear in Halo 2 and served as the inspiration for the abominations design. So, in what I would call a pretty cool move, 343 has canonized the Juggernauts, and I believe that's what we're actually seeing in this second cutscene. But I can't say for sure, obviously. Moving on, as the Flood spreads, Vortis tries to warn Pavium, but his signal can't get through. However, Pavium soon encounters the Flood. He tries to hold the line, wait for Vortis, but is constantly pushed back. The game has you stopping in an area to defend, then retreating to rinse and repeat. Interestingly, in order to retreat, Pavium actually calls in a pair of Goliaths to clear wreckage from their path. Though you sadly never get to use them in any manner, it's nice to see these hunter forms appear. Looking back, it's actually kind of odd that we never saw them in Operation Spearbreaker. But I digress. Eventually, Pavium is forced back to the Banished central base in this area. Around this time, Vortis finally makes contact, revealing that he too had been pushed back but may have found a way to reactivate the Sentinel defenses that he turned off earlier. Pavium makes his final retreat and leaves to meet up with his brother. They meet at a power extraction site near the Forerunner station that would reactivate the Sentinel defenses, but find that their way is blocked by the Flood. In order to make it to the station, the brothers start up an extraction drill to cause a chain reaction in the liquid power that flows through the area and the Ark itself. Their plan is ultimately successful, clearing the way for Vortis. While he descends into the Forerunner station, Pavium stays above ground to continue fighting the Flood and defend the entrance. Once inside, Vortis continues through waves of Flood, including more abominations, before finding a system similar to the one seen in the first level. Covered in Flood, Vortis uses all his forces to clear the Sentinel locks of corruption and fight off a few more waves of Flood. Eventually, however, the locks are cleared and the system reactivated, calling in hundreds of Sentinels to clear the Flood. But the brothers' work is not done, as one of their brute commanders reports another massive Flood form attacking one of their bases. The final level opens with Aatrox contacting the brothers, berating them for their failure. He notes how he had been spending the last 2 months fortifying positions across the Ark to continue the fight against Spirit of Fire, but now must abandon these positions in order to focus on the Flood. The level itself opens with defending against several waves of the Flood before heading out to find the source. Before they can, tentacles appear to block their path, but luckily, Pavium has several mega turrets to take care of this problem. Mega turrets, or siege turrets, sort of first appear in Halo 2. You see a partially constructed one in the level outskirts, but they make their first prominent appearance in the original Halo Wars. Now in Halo Wars 2, we get to command them ourselves, and I have to say, it's pretty awesome. Though available in the third mission, the last mission is where these turrets really play an actual role, clearing Flood tentacles from the battlefield, along with providing general support. As Vortis and Pavium move forward, they are eventually confronted by a proto-Gravemind, this one a remnant of the Gravemind from Halo 3, according to the Phoenix logs. Pavium and Vortis continue their assault, but it isn't enough. In desperation, they restore a Sentinel lock nearby, calling in a Retriever. With the massive Sentinel's help, they destroy the proto-Gravemind. The campaign comes to a close with a final cinematic. The brothers remove their helmets and let out a Jiralhanae cry of victory as Aatrox arrives. He berates the brothers once again and orders them to clean up their mess, stating that he'll be waiting for them when they're done. The final scene is a massive wave of sentinels moving in to cleanse the area. And that concludes the main story of Awakening the Nightmare. For a $20 5-mission DLC, I personally found it more than satisfactory. Voridus and Pavium were great, both enjoyable characters, and the story was self-contained and conclusive. However, there are certainly some criticisms to level at it. First, I'm not the biggest fan of how the Flood returned. The basic logic is that the ring from Halo 3, being incomplete, didn't destroy the Flood as completely as it otherwise should have. Now there's definitely logic there, it makes sense in a lot of ways, but it does feel like something of a cop-out, especially when 343 had previously shown a Flood form to have been stowed away on the Spirit of Fire in Halo Escalation. I mean, they could have had that thing make it to the Ark, run off at some point, and start infecting things while the Banished and Spirit of Fire were busy fighting. I think that would have worked just as well. Another bit of criticism I feel needs to be addressed is that, well, Halo Wars 2's base campaign never felt like it had a proper end, and too much was left unanswered. I would have appreciated even hints at some of those lingering questions in this or the previous DLC, if not a DLC to directly address these things. The rest I think have been addressed throughout this review, though you can tell me in the comments below if I missed anything. The last thing to talk about here are the new Phoenix logs. We touched on a few during the review, but the new stuff in here are some of the best non-story critical logs. We get deeper looks at Tragic Solitude's mindset after the events of Halo 3 and what drove him to want to wipe out all life in Halo Hunters in the Dark. We got some Ungoy humor as one tries to report an incident to Pavium and Voridus, and there are a couple that get into the mindset of the Banished troops. One focuses on Asangheili, Suta Noram, and his trepidation about the legends surrounding High Charity. There's another one about a brute captain, Plutus, as he calls for aid when his position is overrun by the Flood and he is forced to kill his pack brothers and retreat. It reminds me just a bit of Voyage of the Infinite Succor from the Halo graphic novel. And there's also a couple about the UNSC scouting out the area around High Charity a few days before Awakening the Nightmare starts. All of them are quality reads. However, the big ones are the expanded Flood lore, which I'm going to save for another video. There's a lot of fascinating and a few controversial bits of lore that Awakening the Nightmare's Phoenix logs provided, and it's more than worthy of its own video. Anyone who subscribes to Hidden Experian knows what I'm talking about. So with that, let's rate this expansion. I gave the base game an 8 and Spearbreaker an 8.5. For its complete story, vast expansion of the lore, and fun characters, I think Awakening the Nightmare easily deserves a 9 out of 10. So, what did you think of this DLC? What was good and what was bad? Let me know in the comments below. Next time we'll dive into the Flood lore, but until then, this has been Halo Canon. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing, and if you really love me, hit that notification bell and leave a thumbs up. These both really help out the channel. I wouldn't be where I am now without your views and support, so once again, thank you. Keep on being awesome, Canonites.